Well, I'd like to introduce Cheryl Utter to you. She's going to do our third case study. We're up to inferences now, which we typically think of as confidence intervals and hypothesis tests. And Cheryl comes from the Department of Health, and that's the Monroe County Department of Health. That's the county that we're in here in Rochester. And she's manager of health administration. And one of her responsibilities is program evaluation. And one of her programs that she had to evaluate is what she's going to show us today. And her population is a population that we were interested in. And it's not one that you can dilute if you don't like it. Maybe we would like to, but it's, you know what it is? Students, right, okay? So here's Cheryl Otter.
Good morning. I'm going to talk today about the Monroe County Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And I understand from Pat that many of you are from either out of Rochester or even out of the country. So let me just explain a little bit about this. As Pat said, I work for the Monroe County Health Department, which is the health department that serves the entire county, the city and county. It's a consolidated department of about 500 employees. And we provide, regulatory services in terms of environmental health. We provide disease control services in terms of all the diseases you've heard about, sexually transmitted diseases, tuberculosis, any kind of vaccine preventable disease. We provide maternal child health services, school health services. And yesterday you heard from Charlie Knopf, who's in our environmental health laboratory. And then we also have a medical examiner. The medical examiner's office is part of the Monroe County Health Department. So one of the things that is the role of the health department in general, the local health department, is to assess what's going on in the community in terms of health risks and in terms of health status. And one of the ways that we decided to do this about 5 years ago was to determine what was going on with health risk behavior among high school students in Monroe County. Second slide. Don't get too excited about the slides. They're basically an outline, so I know remember what I'm talking about. But I was just going to let you stare at that one for the entire half hour. Basically, the background of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is that it was designed by the Centers for Disease Control in the late 80s, about 88 or 89. And the purpose of it was to determine at what level teenagers, primarily, kids from grades 9 through 12 in high schools, are engaging in behaviors that put them at risk either of immediate injury or death, or in terms of chronic disease, long-term injury, long-term disease or disability. And this was all based on, lots of literature in terms of determining what risk behaviors they were going to analyze. And the CDC had obviously spent a lot of time testing the reliability and the validity of the survey. The survey has been conducted nationally now every other year since 1991. And in 1992, we decided that we would like to try to conduct it locally. Primarily because people at the local level generally have trouble kind of extrapolating national data down to their kids. Just because the national data says that 20% of kids carry a gun to school, well, that couldn't possibly be happening in Monroe County, And it certainly couldn't be happening in Henrietta or Spencerport. Somebody here's from Spencerport. Where is he? So we thought it would be helpful to bring the data down to the local level. There's my Spencerport person over there. So the issues, though, were that we really had to try to figure out how to do that, and we had to try to figure out how to do that successfully. We couldn't just say to people, well, we want to do this survey, and have everybody just say, okay, great. It didn't work that way. So we had a strategy which really was to engage all of the superintendents of all. There are 18 school districts in Monroe County. The biggest one is Rochester City School District, which has about 7,000 high school kids and about, I think it's 6 high schools. And then there are 17 other suburban districts. And so what we decided to do was before we set about even determining that we would do the survey, that we would really discuss with all of those school districts the value of doing that. And we engaged people on the superintendent level, and we also enrolled the help of the Monroe County School Boards Association and talked to the school boards by virtue of being able to bring them to a central place with the School Boards Association meeting, talk to the presidents of the school boards. And so we really laid the groundwork and got people to agree that they would participate in the survey, which really helped a lot in terms of the sampling design. We did get some technical assistance from the Centers for Disease Control in setting up our initial sampling design. But basically what they assume is that a lot of people aren't going to participate, that either a lot of districts aren't going to participate, either or classes within the districts or students within the classes. And so they really built in to their sampling frame a lot of allowances for that kind of thing. And we discovered after that first time that because we had 100% participation of the districts, 100% participation of the classes, and I think at the first survey it was about 92% participation of the students. So we didn't have to be quite as rigid about the sampling design, the design of the sampling frame the next time. We could think about it a little bit differently. The sampling frame basically is who it is that you want to actually look at. And we decided that we couldn't look at every student or every kid in Monroe County between the ages of 12 and 19. There's a lot of kids that aren't in school. There's a lot of kids that are in different kinds of school settings, like a BOCES setting, which is, what is that, cooperative education, and it usually is technical training for high school students. There's some kids in alternative teaching programs, home tutoring, those kinds of things. There's kids in public schools and there's kids in religious schools and private schools. So basically we had to decide what it is we wanted to look at, what was going to be the most efficient way to look at things, and to recognize that when we present the data that we need to present it as being limited in some fashion. So what we decided to do was to sample the students in public high schools, grades 9 through 12 in mainstream programs. So that when you look at the survey results later, you'll get a handout showing some of the survey results. What you need to remember is this is probably a pretty conservative estimate of what some of the risk behaviors are, because it doesn't take into account those kids who are out of school or who are in alternative programs. In Monroe County, there's about 27,000 high school students in those grades 9 through 12 public high school students. And so we had to determine what kind of a sample size we needed. And I know somebody was here yesterday from Gordon Black and probably talked a little bit about sample size and that kind of thing. As I said, the CDC originally had given us a package to determine sample size. Then we ended up using a Quattro Pro model and basically based it on the assumption that we wanted to have a margin of error of 5%, and we were going to assume a participation rate of 80%, which is conservative. Because we figured it's better to survey too many kids and have good data than not survey enough. So we then set about designing a random sample where random classes were chosen from each school in a random fashion that contributed to the overall survey, so that each school's data would not in any way represent that individual school, but it just fed into the larger survey. We had trouble explaining that to the districts. And it was interesting because I had this dread of standing up in front of 18 school superintendents and trying to talk about data collection and why we're doing it this way. And it turned out, that I didn't really need to worry about that because they didn't know any more about it than I did. So they basically took what I said as gospel, which was a little frightening because, I certainly wasn't prepared to provide that level of effort. But what I think it's a lesson that when you're dealing with this kind of thing, you really do need to know enough, and you need to know it well, to be confident in presenting it to other people. And you also need to know what you don't know, and try not to get in over your head, because it could really destroy your credibility. So basically, we got all of the districts to agree. We conducted the first survey in 1992. The second survey in 1995, and we just completed the third survey, which I like to call the Youth Risk Behavior Survey from Hell. because we really had a lot of different problems this time that I didn't anticipate. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. Response rate, as I discussed, one of the ways that we tried to ensure a response rate was really to get people to buy in ahead of time. And once the superintendents had committed, then the principals and the teachers basically followed behind that. And even with that, we had difficulty in some of the districts where perhaps it wasn't as clear that when the superintendent said, you do this, you do this. So, but generally, as I said, we had a very good response rate in both surveys that we've done so far, and as far as I can tell, preliminarily in this last one. Controls are important, and by that I mean you need to know a little bit about who it is you're surveying, or actually as much about who it is you're surveying as you can, before you even conduct the survey. So one of the things that we did is we talked to each district and asked them about their enrollment. You know, what were their enrollment by grade and what was their enrollment by gender, so that we had some sense of what the population looked like before we did the survey. Once we got the survey data, we then compared that data with the population as a whole to see if in fact it kind of matched the general distribution of grade and gender. So that's very important to have that information and to be ready to look at it. The other thing is that we did a lot of work with the districts in terms of exactly how the survey was to be conducted, in terms of the confidentiality issues. One of the things about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is it asks some very personal questions. It asks about sexual behavior, it asks about drinking, smoking, drugs and alcohol use. And what we want to be able to do is to assure the kids that their survey is completely confidential, so that at least they answer it to the best of their ability. If they're in the mood to answer it, that they'll do the best that they can. So all those kinds of controls were important to build into the design, not just of the sampling frame and how you're going to actually sample the classes, but also in terms of how you're going to make sure that what you get back is what you went out to get, so that you don't have to worry about those things when you're analyzing the data. And to the degree that you can do that, it can help prevent a lot of headaches down the road in terms of adjusting data or having to clean data more than you might want to. And then the data review speaks to that. Like, for example, I'm just now getting back the third survey's data. And so I'm looking at whether or not what is the distribution according to what the current distribution is of classes and gender. Does it look pretty representative of what's going on in the districts? And the other thing is, because now I need to compare this survey with the last survey, with the first survey, I need to know, do the populations within the surveys look fairly similar? And you would think, you know, we're surveying the same schools, we're doing the same design, but the second time that we did it, actually the second time we did use a different survey design. We got a gender distribution of 54% females and 46% males, as opposed to roughly 51-49. And we also had a younger age distribution. The kids in the second survey were a little bit younger than the kids in the first survey. And we wanted to compare the data. So that was an important thing for us to be aware of, that the populations in the two surveys might be enough different that it might influence the outcome of the data. So the data review is very important. We can't just assume that just because we've set it all up and we've been so careful about the sample design and so careful about the controls that we're still going to get what we can't assume anything, basically, what we expected to get. Are there any questions so far?
What about private schools? Is that included at all?
Yeah, we didn't include private schools in any of the three surveys, but we've now been approached by private schools, a couple of private schools who would like to be included. So I think that one of our major concerns the first time around was the whole credibility issue. You know, was this important? Why was it important? Districts were concerned about district level data being released. They were concerned that if the press, for example, got a hold of district level data, that there would be, you know, problems trying to defend their programs or whatever. And so with the first survey, what we did is we did a county-wide sample where all of the schools participated and contributed to the county-wide sample. The second time around, because of the success of the first time and the fact that it wasn't, although the press is always very interested in surveys, and they're very interested in surveys about kids, It was handled very well. There was a lot of participation between the health department and the communications people in the various districts as to how to present it. So that went very well. The second time around, because of that, 5 districts decided that in addition to contributing to the county sample, they wanted to have district level data as well. So they actually, instead of maybe doing 100 surveys, many of them surveyed their whole populations, as many as 1,000 kids in their district, and then had district level data that they can use for planning. And then this third time around, out of the 18 districts, 9 districts chose to do it at the district level. So I think the reputation is growing, that it's a safe thing, that it's helpful to have the data, and now some of the, actually even the parochial schools have approached us. So.
I wondered, did you having prior knowledge of the distribution of your population before this survey? Why did you go with simple random sampling rather than stratified? So at the end, you know you will have equal representation?
Well, because we weren't that sophisticated, quite frankly. You know, I think part of the purpose of today's seminar is to kind of talk about what people face out in the real world. And basically what we were trying to do was to do as reasonably scientific a job as we could with limited resources in terms of having available to us statisticians who could say, well, do it this way. And, but that's an excellent point. I just took I think in the program it says I'm enrolled in the EMBA program at RIT, and I just took a statistics course. So maybe next time I can do that and not have to worry about, not have to worry at the end about adjusting the data.
Could we just follow it up for a minute? When you select a class from a high school, I assume that's the level you're at.
Right.
That was just random?
Right. We used, we knew the population of the school, and we knew the average class size, and then we used a random number list generator.
So it was a likelihood that, in fact, in this survey, you could have had all grade 9 students. Is that correct?
That would be unlikely.
Well, I understand.
It's possible. It has happened in some of the schools, in some of the individual schools, but it balances out. And the shift from the first survey to the second wasn't a radical shift. It was, and I think that why we had a little bit younger population the second time around is we did a little bit better. We have 2 districts, I think it's 2 districts, possibly 3, where there's a separate 9th grade building. The 9th graders are in a separate building. They're in a middle school, basically. And so the first time around, what we did is we treated those 9th through 12th graders as one unit. And the second time around, we said, okay, if these 9th graders are in a separate building, let's sample them as a separate building. And I think that that's why we got a little bit, we got actually a better representation of 9th graders and, you know, the younger students in the second sample.
Now, did you do any checking on the truthfulness of the responses and so on, or was that possible?
Well, that's part of the reliability and validity testing that the whole instrument has gone through with the CDC. And so, you know, we just kind of depend on the fact that to the degree that they've tested it, that the responses are generally valid. You can tell, you know, some of them you can tell. You could look at we have bubble sheets, and you can look at the patterns on the bubble sheets. You know, some people write little notes to you in the bubbles. You know, not very complimentary notes. And some people, you can see that they've just gone down and marked all A's and or all D's, or they've gone like zigzags or whatever. But generally, what I do though sometimes is like, for example, there's several questions about sexual behavior and cigarette smoking, for example. There's like maybe 8 questions about cigarettes. And so there's always a choice, I have never smoked cigarettes. And so I try to take a look and see if the I have never smoked cigarettes is pretty much the same percentage for every question, or if people are messing around and answering the question differently. So I do some things like that just to kind of double check and make sure that there aren't some really bizarre surveys that the pattern wasn't as obvious. Were there some more questions?
Hold on what you just said. What you find one of those patterns that doesn't seem to fit? What do you do with it? You draw that data?
If I feel really uncomfortable about this, yes, I just throw out that record. And the ones where we had the funny, you know, where it's obvious, they don't even go through the scanner because it's clear that they were not interested. Why don't I go on to the next slide, and then we can ask some more questions. I told Pat I was worried about talking for half an hour, but apparently it's not a problem. Okay, so once we've got all the data that hopefully, because we've done the sampling design correctly and we've built in our controls and we've ensured confidentiality, we've got some relatively good data, we need to think about how to analyze it. Basically, one of the things that I learned the first time around, I actually learned it the second time around. The first time around, we wrote this huge report that was, it took me like probably 2 weeks solid to write this report. And it had graphs, and it had charts, and it had this, and it had that, and it compared our data to the New York State data. And one of the things that I really had no idea of at the time, that didn't even occur to me, is that when you're comparing data between two surveys, you can't just assume that the numbers are based on the same level of confidence. So for example, in the state survey, if it said 27% of the kids smoked cigarettes, and in ours it said 21%, and I said, oh, look at this, Monroe County is really way ahead of the game here. Well, maybe we weren't, because I didn't take into account at all the confidence intervals, and that's because, again, at that point, I didn't know what I didn't know. The second time around, when we needed to compare our second survey with our first survey, I became aware of that. In the meantime, I had done a lot of kind of reading, and I talked to people at the CDC, and so I felt really good about what we did in terms of comparing the first survey of ours and the second survey of ours, because we took into account the fact that there are different confidence intervals for different questions, and depending on response rates and that kind of thing, that what looks different can be the same. Just the numerator and denominator, this is like a minor point, but basically, and I'm not sure if this is maybe somebody here knows if this is a standard protocol or whether it's just a protocol for this type of survey data that we're doing specifically, but in terms of percentage, this is basically percentage responses that we're getting here. We have X% of the respondents said this. And as the denominator, we take out the either the non-respondents or the responses where they're out of the range of the appropriate responses. And again, not everybody follows that little rule. So when you're comparing data, you need to be careful about that when you're comparing your own data to other people's data. Just because our percentage looks bigger, maybe they didn't take out their non-respondents, so that they aren't in fact measuring the real value. So that's kind of a minor point, as I said, but it's important. Comparing the two surveys, as I mentioned, in the second survey, the population was a bit younger, and the gender distribution was actually quite a bit off compared to what you would expect of gender distribution. So what I had to do before I could do anything else was determine whether or not that made a difference if it could make a difference in the responses. And I ended up having to adjust the data from the second survey using the first survey's population numbers as kind of a standard population. So like, if you know about age-adjusted death rates, where you compare where to help you compare death rates across different populations, you adjust them to a standard population. And so that's what I did. And to be quite honest with you, I couldn't possibly tell you now how I did it, except that I will probably have to relearn it in the next couple of weeks. But I did it using a Quattro Pro model that I developed. So that was one of the tools that I used to do that. So once I determined that, in fact, this age and grade difference or age and gender difference had made no difference in the outcome of the survey, then I was able to proceed and say with some degree of surety that there were differences in the survey that were not in fact based on the population differences. So one of the things that I had to do was to actually calculate confidence intervals for every question. One of the things I think that you probably are familiar with, and it is a common thing out there in the world, is that there really aren't a lot of easy tools for people to use to look at these kinds of data. Some of the ones on the bottom that are listed there that I used were EpiInfo, which is a package that's available from the Centers for Disease Control. And it's actually a public domain program that can be downloaded from the internet. And it was designed to help local health departments, to actually give local health departments some tools in terms of using some statistical analyses and being able particularly to analyze disease outbreaks. So that has a lot of handy little tools in it, of which I found a couple more yesterday that are very helpful, that can help you determine sample size and can help you determine what the confidence intervals are for particular issues. In my stats course, we've really used Excel very heavily, Excel 7.0. I saw somebody here had a book for 5.0. And the Quattro Pro version I use is quite a bit older than the Excel version, and I understand that most of the spreadsheet applications are really starting to add statistical analyses capabilities to the spreadsheets. But that has a lot of capabilities in terms of doing regression analysis and all of that, and simple descriptive statistics. And then StatCalc is another little freebie from the CDC. It might have cost $10, but it's just a little program with lots of little icons that, if you want to do confidence intervals, you click on that and put in the data, and it gives you the confidence intervals. So those are some tools that we use. But I think that's a big weakness, and I think that's probably being addressed a little bit in the last few years with the increase in technology available to people and the kind of demystification of some of the statistical stuff in terms of what's available on regular software programs. Then in the next phase, once we had developed the confidence intervals, then we needed to look at whether or not the differences between the two surveys were in fact significant statistically, meaning that they couldn't be assigned to just chance. And again, that was, it was kind of learn as you go. And basically, the very first thing I did is I said, okay, if these are the confidence intervals and these are the two values and the confidence intervals don't overlap, well, then they're different, which is true. But what I didn't realize is that they could overlap somewhat and still be statistically different, probably at a lower level of significance. And so one of the resources that I had was a person who's called a pediatric fellow at Rochester General Hospital, who is very familiar with all of these kinds of statistical analyses and was very interested in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And he gave me some different tools to use, specifically the Z test, which basically is a little bit more precise and allowed me to say that some things were significantly different that I wouldn't have said before. And the thing is, you might say, well, why does it matter? You're doing a community survey. And I think, though, that the main reason that we're interested in being able to, first of all, educate the public a little bit about how to look at surveys, not to look at two numbers. We had one situation where we were doing a pre-test and a post-test. And in the pre-test, 37% of the students said something, and in the post-test, 36% said something. And the people who were reviewing the test to try to decide if they wanted to do this course again said, well, they got worse. They took the course and they got worse. And, didn't understand that clearly there was really no difference there at all, which wasn't a good thing, but they didn't get worse. So we do feel some need to play a technical advice role in the community to the degree that we can. We have many programs in the health department that require evaluation. We have many programs with our community partners that evaluation would be nice, and it's good for people to understand this stuff. Also, in terms of local, at the county level, it's not as important. Although we do have, for example, one campaign called the Not Me, Not Now campaign, which I'm not sure probably all you people from out of town aren't familiar with, but basically it's a mass media campaign to encourage delayed sexual activity among teens, and it's focused, I think, on 9 to 14-year-olds. And so, to the degree that we can know that there are many other variables that contribute to kids having sexual intercourse, we can use this county-level data, if there's a change, as one measure, one rough measure of the effectiveness of the Not Me, Not Now campaign. At a district level, where the districts can actually implement a program to address a specific issue, it's really nice to know if what they did actually made a difference, because they're investing time and money in those programs and want to show success. So it's important, I think. and for you to take away with you. And basically, this is an executive summary of the report that we did. Again, one of the things that is important is how to convey all this to the lay audience, which basically you assume that you want to, at least we were assuming that we wanted to convey this certainly to all the school districts and the teachers, but also to PTAs and the kinds of people who are interacting with kids. So it needs to be written in a way that's not like totally technical and yet addresses some of those issues that I've talked about today. So this describes, what the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is, the methodology, some of the concerns about comparing the two surveys, and then at the very last page are some of the data that you might be interested in. And there are 84 questions on the survey itself. Of the 84, I'm trying to, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 15 questions of the 84 showed a significant difference between the 1992 survey and the 1995 survey. And as you can see, I've talked about what the values were for each year, what the significance level was, and basically they're all different at p less than 0.01 unless it's specified otherwise. And then what the trend was. Is it better, is it worse, or are we unable to determine whether or not it's better or worse? And so this is the kind of data that is presented to the public. The report itself is probably about maybe 15 or 20 pages and talks a lot about comparing us to the year 2000 goals and objectives, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but those are goals and objectives for health status that were established by the Centers for Disease Control. And they have all kinds of measures to determine whether or not, how we stand in terms of those. So do we have other questions?
Pretty much how you report your findings is using p-values as levels of significance?
Yes. Generally, it's something that most people have some sense of what that means. Again, we're trying to convey it in a way that people understand it.
Would the superintendents of the school board understand it?
Well, they pretend to. They understand the concept of significance, obviously, I'm sure there are many superintendents who know a lot more about this than, but it's like all of you, my understanding anyway, you took a course a long time ago, you might use it, certainly use the concepts depending on your job, but, you don't use the details of it. And now with all of the computer stuff available, you don't even have to, which is kind of the scary part, you don't really even have to understand the details of it. And what I found helpful is that, a couple of years ago anyway, I didn't have these tools, and so I really had to go back and read the books and figure out what it is I was doing and what I was trying to say to people to feel comfortable with it. It's one thing to plug it into a little program on the computer, but then to try to explain it to someone. Mm-hmm.
How much information do you have as to how much correlation there is between schools and within classes?
We don't really have any of that information because, well, we could compare in the total survey, we could compare grade levels, and we could compare gender, which we have done.
It seems to me that if you have, it's at least plausible in some things such as sexual activity and cigarette smoking, that you might have certain classrooms that there might be stronger than random correlation within peer groups.
Yeah.
And which would have the effect of greatly reducing your effective sample size. I mean, to take an extreme case, if within any one class either everyone smoked or nobody did, then your sample might be about 30 of the size that it appeared to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've done some, the person that I spoke of, the guy who's the pediatric fellow at General, has done a lot of regression analysis to determine what correlations there are between negative behaviors and certain variables. And the one that he found a significant correlation between was kids who are old for grade level. So basically, now some of these kids may be kids that just started school late, so I don't know how he corrected for that. You know how you decide whether to put your kid in kindergarten at 5 or at 6? But many of them are kids who are have been failing, and so like they're 15 and they're in the well, they're probably 18 or 19 and in the 9th or 10th grade. And so he did find a correlation between old for grade and some of the negative, smoking and drug use and alcohol use and that kind of thing. But we've never done an interclass correlation. So that might be an interesting thing to look at. Any other questions? People ready for coffee?
Well, we'd like to thank you very much for taking your time to